As far as challenges go, it's a monster.
We come to this summit with an open mind, an ambitious spirit, encapsulated by the target to end, not reduce, but end violence against women and children.
2 days, 9 topics, including family violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, financial freedom, respect at work, coercive control, and policing and justice.
It is a place for sharing. It is a forum for listening. It is a platform for change.
Announced in the wake of this year's National Reckoning,
Making noise!
the summit will form the basis of a new 10-year plan to end violence against women. The current plan due to lapse next year.
What we can absolutely say already is that the job is certainly not done, and arguably it's barely even been started. Domestic, family and sexual violence remains a national crisis.
Experts, including the women who helped trigger the summit, are sceptical. Grace Tame tweeting, "Scott has just finished his opening keynote address, in which he appropriated private disclosures from survivors to leverage his own image. Gee, I bet it felt good to get that out." Brittany Higgins, who was only invited at the last minute after the ACT government stepped in, tweeting, "While I respect the Prime Minister's ambitious spirit, I just can't match this government's actions with the platitudes and warm sentiments they're extending today."
Last week, while the summit roundtables were underway, the government voted not to pass the majority of the legislative recommendations made in the Respect at Work report. This was an incredibly demoralising update to receive. If we don't have a commitment at the highest level to implementing these types of reforms, how are we possibly going to be able to tackle domestic, family and sexual violence in all its forms across all communities?
Advocates and the women of this country demanding that this time the government turn its
ambitious spirit
into action.
To think about what would a truly, wholly funded family violence response look like in Australia. That's what we need to see this government commit to.
Australian of the Year and sexual assault survivor Grace Tame was logged on to the summit today and joins us now. Grace, we heard there the Prime Minister spoke of the summit being a platform for change. Are you hopeful that that is what the summit will be?
Oh, look, yes, I am hopeful that this will be a platform for change, but I'm also grateful and reassured because this is not the only platform for change.
How do you mean?
People, advocates, activists, the community have been working tirelessly in this space. All of this work predates the summit and it will live on beyond the summit.
Grace, you're very critical of the Prime Minister's speech. What were you hoping for him to say?
As frustrated as I am by the hypocrisies, by the insensitivity towards survivors, by the platitudes, I don't want to focus on the negatives. This is ultimately a timestamp. The entire nation is watching and the government has an opportunity to listen and learn to all of the asks, all of the major themes that come up from this summit, that have come up already and that will come up tomorrow. And we can only hope that those things are applied. We can only hope that the government puts its money, its policies and its laws where its mouth is.
Rightly or wrongly, the negativity has been focused today, with most people reporting about what you said about the Prime Minister rather than what was achieved at the summit.
Look, that is as may be, but I think it is more important than anything else that we remember. Ultimately, we do have to put our differences aside and we have to work together to create actual change, actual structural change here as a united force. Yes, I did have some personal issues with the way that Prime Minister used survivors' stories not on their terms, which is completely unethical. But we have to focus on the positives. We have to focus on the positives.
Grace, what's the most important action the government could take right now in your eyes to impact change on this?
The most important thing that the government can do is re-centre its focus to prevention, to education, stopping these things from happening.
That has been a focus of a lot of governments now for quite a few years. We've seen, respectful relationships, for example, programs like that being introduced in schools. So I'm thinking here particularly of state governments. And one of the frustrations of advocates has been that in spite of that, over the past few years, there hasn't been significant change in the outcome when it comes to violence against women. Why is it that you think that remains the centre of the issue?
Because although there has been some attention put on primary prevention, it's still not the main focus. When you look at the $1.1 billion that's been injected into the issue of women's safety, only $35 million has been put into primary prevention. And if we look at the program Respect Matters, that's for consent education. Originally, that was only $2.8 million. In 2019, they injected that, and that was for a 3-year period. And then in the 2020 Education, Skills and Employment budget statement, that amount of $2.8 million was inexplicably slashed to $1.36 million for the same 3-year period. And as my friend Shana Bremner pointed out, if you divide $1.36 million by 4 million students that are enrolled in schools across the nation, you get 11 cents per student, and you can't even buy a milkshake with 11 cents.
I wonder if that milkshake was a very specifically chosen reference by you there, Grace. Thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. We appreciate your time.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
Well, we're now joined by Anne Ruston, the Minister for Women's Safety. Minister, we just heard there from Grace. She spoke about the Prime Minister's speech today. She says it was quite unethical of the PM to use survivors' testimony not on their terms. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, obviously Grace is absolutely entitled to her opinion, but I genuinely believe that the Prime Minister was absolutely genuine. The testimony that he used was the testimony of people who had written to him personally. And I believe he absolutely meant every word that he said this morning.
The other thing that Grace mentioned to us was particularly to do with funding on preventative measures and especially around education in schools. You might have actually heard her at the end saying it breaks down to about 11 cents per student. Do you think the funding has been good enough, and particularly that point she makes about the fact that it was cut on certain programs?
Well, there are a number of programs that are running at the moment, and most importantly around consent, which is one of the issues that Grace is very loud advocate for. And only this week we announced $29 million towards a consent program to make sure that people understand the meaning of consent. But the $1.1 billion that we outlaid at this budget was a down payment or a transition payment towards the next national plan. And that's what we're doing here with the summit, what we did last week with the roundtables, what we've been doing with the consultation about the next national plan over the last year, is making sure we hear from people like Grace about what they think is important so we can make the next national plan a plan that really delivers and ends violence once and for all against women and their children.
Minister, the PM talked the talk today, but how can the public have any faith in the government that they're going to walk the walk when they're not implementing all of the Respect at Work recommendations to stop women being harassed on the job?
Well, first of all, just to be very clear, the 55 recommendations at the Respect at Work report, not one of them has been rejected by the government. Last week we sought to legislate to put in place improvements to the legal framework, but there are a number of other recommendations in those 55, many of which don't even sit within the legislative purview of the federal government. Some are for state and territory governments, some are for the private sector, some don't require legislation. And also we have been very clear that there are a number of those recommendations that are quite complex and will need further consideration and consultation before we bring them back to the Parliament. So to suggest that we have rejected any of the recommendations is simply not true.
Minister, the Prime Minister delivered the keynote address. He's now copped it from his critics. In hindsight, was it a mistake to have the PM make the major speech here rather than yourself?
Not at all. I think that we needed to elevate this issue to the highest place in our Parliament, and that is the Prime Minister. You know, we need to have a national conversation, but what I would say is that I don't think there is any Australian who doesn't actually want the same outcome. Every single one of us wants to end violence against women and their children. And I think if we all work together, we can actually achieve that. But I think the national focus today was on this place in the Parliament, and the leader of this government needed to be the person who set the agenda to make sure that every Australian understands they've got a role to play in ending violence against women and their children, because if everybody doesn't play their role, we probably won't succeed.
Minister, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
With so much content online, it's sometimes hard to keep up with it all. And let's face it, who has the time? The Project YouTube has you covered with the stories that matter. Hit subscribe for a daily list of the news that you need to know.